Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into a really fascinating philosophical framework for reversing your destiny. We usually think of destiny as this fixed, pre-written script, right? Like we're just actors forced to play out our parts. But what if, actually, scratch that, what if the script is being written right now by our own subconscious habits? What if the things holding us back aren't some mysterious external forces, but literally just the ingrained ways we process our daily challenges? That is the massive perspective shift we're exploring today.
Specifically, we're going to be mapping out the methodology presented in Chapter 1 of Ryuho Okawa's The Laws of Miracles. The core argument here is incredibly empowering. It basically states that human thought patterns have a direct, measurable impact on our fate. So we're going to look at exactly how to move from that awful state of emotional overwhelm, where you feel totally at the mercy of the world, into a state of highly rational, decisive action. Let's kick things off with a pretty profound question about human nature. Why is it that when someone tells us something amazing is going to happen, we instantly cross our arms and look for the catch? But if someone predicts total doom and gloom, man, we just eat it right up and brace for impact. It's wild, right? But understanding why we do this is absolutely crucial. It's the very first key to actually changing your destiny. And that brings us right into Section 1, the trap of negativity. So our internal logic here is actually super fascinating. It turns out we naturally lean towards pessimistic predictions purely out of a self-defense instinct. Think about it. Believing something bad is going to happen just feels psychologically safer. If things go wrong, well, you were prepared, so the shock isn't as bad. But positive predictions, those require hope. And if we buy into false hope and get let down, we feel betrayed. We feel foolish. So to protect ourselves from that massive sting of disappointment, we literally choose pessimism because it feels safer. And this dynamic perfectly explains why the misfortune industry is so huge. I'm talking about mass media, fortune tellers, astrologers. This whole industry is basically a business model built entirely on our collective anxieties. If a forecaster predicts a terrible market crash and it doesn't happen, nobody gets mad. We're just relieved. But if they promise you'll strike it rich and you lose everything, the outrage is massive. We literally feed on negativity because we are wired to consume it without even questioning it. So how do we stop this cycle? Well, we have to take a step back. Let's look at Section 2, objectifying your thought patterns. Have you ever noticed that you kind of tend to fail in the exact same ways over and over? The text describes this as being trapped on a roller coaster of fate. Whenever a specific type of challenge pops up, say a conflict at work or a sudden financial stressor, we jump right back on that same emotional ride. We react with the exact same anxiety or defensiveness every single time. And until we can step back and analyze our own reactions objectively like a third-party observer, we're just going to stay stuck on that ride forever. If we don't catch these patterns, we fall into what the author brilliantly calls a crayfish lifestyle. I absolutely love this imagery. Think about a crayfish. The second it senses even a hint of danger, what does it do? It instantly darts backward. When we let pessimistic thoughts manipulate us, we do the exact same thing in life. We sense a storm coming, and instead of holding our ground to solve the issue, we just retreat. We let fear completely take the wheel. Which brings us to the big question. How do we stop being the crayfish? Let's get into a really practical prescription in Section 3, Life as a Workbook. Instead of emotionally panicking, the text suggests treating life like a workbook. Problems aren't these massive existential threats. They're just math equations waiting to be solved. And there's a highly rational methodology for this. First, divide the problems. Break them down quantitatively or temporally. Second, prioritize and rank them. And third, execute a pinpoint attack. Don't try to fight the whole army at once, Just find the single most critical target, focus all your energy right there, and take it out. By chopping overwhelming issues into measurable time frames, the impossible suddenly feels totally manageable. Look at your massive mountain of stress and just ask yourself, okay, what can actually be solved today? What can wait until next week or next month? It's exactly like breaking down a huge debt into monthly payments. Once you map your anxieties to a timeline, the emotional overwhelm just kind of stops and your rational brain gets to step up. A great metaphor the text uses for this is snow shoveling. Imagine a huge blizzard just dumped 3 feet of snow on your roof. If you just stare at the whole roof, it's terrifying. You think it's going to cave in. But obviously, you can't clear an entire roof of snow with one giant swipe. It's physically impossible. You have to tackle it one single scoop of the shovel at a time. Every single scoop lightens the load.
You just figure out where to put the shovel next, and you keep scooping.
But hey, what happens when the problems are just too heavy and no amount of shoveling seems to be working? What if you feel like you're actively sinking? Let's explore Section 4, the power of discarding. The author paints this really visceral picture. Imagine you're on a boat, right, in the middle of a massive typhoon, and you are taking on water fast. The boat is sinking because it's just too heavy. To survive, you have to ruthlessly toss cargo overboard. And look, you might have loaded that boat with things you deeply value, your social status, your money, conveniences, or literal heavy furniture like a safe. But in a crisis, trying to hold on to everything is going to cost you your life. You have to look at your worldly attachments and say, to survive this storm, this has got to go. And here's the really important part. Making that conscious choice of what to discard is exactly what saves your mind. It strips away that toxic obsession with trying to have it all. When you can finally say, you know what, I'm willing to let go of this status if it means keeping my peace of mind, your internal suffering drastically drops. The anxiety just melts away because you've accepted the loss of the cargo to save the ship. Okay, so once we've cleared away those negative patterns, shoveled the snow, and tossed out the heavy burdens, we reach the final stage of transformation. Section 5, Seeds of the Future. The text anchors this final step with a timeless truth, one that great philosophers like Emerson, Marcus Aurelius, and William James all landed on. A person is exactly what they think. You aren't your resume, you aren't your clothes, you are the culmination of the thoughts you repeat to yourself every single day. If you really want to reverse your destiny, you have to realize that your thoughts are the literal building blocks of your reality. Because our thoughts build our reality, we have to actively plant positive seeds of the mind. Think of your mind like a garden. If you let it run wild, those weeds of pessimism and fear we talked about earlier, they're going to completely take over. We have to nurture positive seeds very carefully to make sure we don't lose the battle against our own negativity. When a bad thought creeps in, you have to actively deploy a positive countermeasure. You've got to fight for the harvest you want. So how does this become a daily practice? Well, reversing your destiny isn't magic. It's a combination of extreme pragmatism and guarded optimism. By focusing purely on the actionable steps today, scooping the snow that's right in front of you, while keeping your absolute optimism alive for tomorrow, you literally rewrite the script. You stop being the crayfish retreating from fear, and you become the true architect of your timeline. As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a thought. Reversing your destiny starts with the exact thought you're choosing to entertain right now, in this moment. So what seeds are you planting in your mind today? Are you planting seeds of anxiety, bracing for the worst because it feels safe? Or are you planting seeds of resilience, breaking your problems down and trusting yourself to handle tomorrow? I'll let you reflect on that and the harvest those thoughts are guaranteed to bring.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating, multi-layered look at Japan's post-war mindset by unpacking Chapter 2 of The Laws of Miracles. We'll be objectively exploring some deeply unconventional historical, psychological, and spiritual arguments that attempt to explain the nation's economic stagnation and, ultimately, its future potential.
To help us navigate all these complex concepts, here is our roadmap. 1. The psychology of stagnation. 2. Overcoming post-war guilt. 3. Rethinking Japan's historical role. 4. A spiritual view of war. 5. Critiquing materialism and socialism. And finally, 6. Establishing global values. Let's kick things off with Section 1, The Psychology of Stagnation Beyond the Economic Bubble. The author argues that the burst of the 1990s Japanese bubble economy wasn't just some standard financial hiccup. It was actually a manifestation of collective psychological trauma. You see, as Japan's economy boomed and started to seriously rival the United States, a sort of collective panic set in. Deep down, the text suggests, the Japanese psyche was terrified of actually taking the #1 spot because they simply had no roadmap for what to do once they caught up to America.
This really highlights the text's core premise. To understand the economic reality, you've got to look at the underlying psychological complex. While most financial commentators at the time said, hey, it's just a necessary market correction, this book looks at it as a self-sabotaging narrative. By choosing this path, the nation basically bought itself time. It was much easier to retreat into a comfortable, less threatening runner-up position than to step up as a true global leader.
Moving right along to Section 2, Overcoming Post-War Guilt, the Weight of History.
The author throws out a really provocative question here to actively challenge the prevailing post-war historical narrative. The book proposes that what's truly holding the nation back is this pervasive, self-deprecating historical view, this ingrained sense that absolutely everything Japan did leading up to and during the Second World War was purely malicious. The book asserts that post-war Japan has been sort of locked in this victor's justice mentality, which creates a paralyzing cycle of endless apologies. The text specifically points to the Tokyo trials as establishing a narrative of inherent evil, and even calls out certain foreign religious movements active in Japan that push this idea of an original, historical sin. And the author is firm on this point. Without shaking off this guilt complex, Japan simply cannot forge a meaningful path forward in the 21st century.
Which brings us to Section 3, Rethinking Japan's Historical Role, from Meiji to WWI.
To untangle this guilt, the book maps out a very specific historical sequence. Starting way back in 1853 with Commodore Perry's arrival, Japan was essentially faced with a stark choice: modernize and defend itself, or become a colony like so much of the non-Western world. The author frames the subsequent military actions not merely as unprovoked aggression, but as a desperate, urgent fight for national survival against aggressive Western imperialism.
Furthermore, the text claims that these conflicts actually served a massive, almost unintended purpose: dismantling white supremacy and sparking the liberation of colonies. By highlighting the Russo-Japanese War as a major turning point, the source argues that defeating a European power shattered the absolute myth of Western invincibility. In this framework, the legacy of the Greater East Asia War was ultimately the crumbling of Western colonial empires, leaving behind a world where Asia and Africa were finally freed from centuries of foreign domination.
Let's pivot slightly with Section 4, a spiritual view of war, the role of the divine.
Now here's where things get really fascinating. The text introduces a totally unique religious framework with the concept of national gods, spiritual entities believed to guide and protect a nation's destiny. The argument here is that Shinto deities actually supported that grand overarching goal of ending Western colonial dominance. So, from a spiritual perspective, the initial ideals of liberating Asia were perfectly aligned with the will of these protective deities.
But, and this is a critical distinction, the author maintains a highly nuanced stance here. While the spiritual intent was defensive and aimed at liberation, the earthly military completely lost the plot. The text argues the leaders on the ground basically ran away with the power, totally ignoring divine guidance and spiraling into extremes. So while the macro objective of ending colonization ultimately succeeded, the horrific methods and the human tragedy of the war were a massive failure of human execution, leading to Japan's devastating defeat.
Next up is Section 5, Critiquing Materialism and Socialism, the Ideological Failure. Contrasting this spiritual worldview with secular 20th century ideologies, the book strongly condemns materialism and violent socialist revolutions, like Marxism. Why? Well, if you fundamentally believe humans are just biological robots, mere physical matter, the text argues that it completely strips away all inherent human dignity. And philosophically, that reduction is exactly what makes it so terrifyingly easy for these regimes to justify violent revolutions and mass purges. The source material specifically points to the catastrophic loss of life in the Soviet Union, China, and Cambodia as the inevitable result of this worldview. We're talking about roughly 20 million people killed across communist regimes. It's presented as a stark, chilling warning. When a society abandons spiritual worth and treats humans as disposable cogs in an ideological machine, massive atrocities are practically guaranteed to follow.
Finally, we arrive at Section 6, Establishing Global Values, the Path Forward. So what is the author's ultimate solution? The text outlines a very clear roadmap. First, overcome that historical trauma. Second, reject purely materialistic ideologies. And third, establish a new standard of righteousness on a global scale. Japan's role, according to the author, isn't to shrink back in fear of success, and it certainly isn't to repeat past military mistakes. Instead, it's to take these hard-learned lessons and construct a global value system that brings both individual and collective happiness.
The big conclusion here is that ancient, regional religions urgently need to evolve. In our highly interconnected, globally mobile world, thousands of years old tribal teachings just aren't going to cut it anymore. To prevent ideological clashes and actually guide humanity forward, the author argues we need a unified, modern spiritual teaching, one that successfully bridges the gap between rapid scientific progress and fundamental spiritual dignity.
I'll leave you with this final, really provocative question from the text. Can a nation overcome deep historical trauma to pioneer a universally righteous global value system? By untangling the psychological knots of post-war guilt and firmly rejecting materialism, the author of The Laws of Miracles truly believes a brighter, unified future is out there. It's certainly a lot to chew on, right? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this deep dive has given you a profound new perspective to reflect on.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are setting the stage for a truly fascinating deep dive into the intersection of ancient spirituality and our hyper-modern society. If you've ever found yourself wondering how traditional belief systems can possibly survive, let alone thrive, in an era of such rapid technological and social change, well, you are in exactly the right place. But hey, before we even touch the philosophy, let's look at a cold, hard number. 1/4, eventually rising to 1/3. That is the projected ratio of the elderly population in modern nations. Think about that for a second. It's a massive, completely unavoidable structural shift. And as our source material points out, it's a physical reality that forces a total re-evaluation of how our society functions. I mean, any belief system or institution that just ignores this demographic tidal wave, they're going to be completely left behind. So let's get right into it. The source for our explainer today is The Laws of Miracles by Ryuho Okawa. We're focusing heavily on the arguments laid out in Chapter 3, which is all about the new winds of religion. This chapter sets up an incredibly high-stakes dilemma. How exactly does faith hold on to its core identity in the 21st century without being crushed by modern secular forces? It's this brilliant look at adaptation versus assimilation, and the blueprint it offers is just profoundly relevant for us today. To unpack this blueprint, here's our roadmap. We've got 4 main stops to break down this balancing act. First, demographic realities. Second, religion and politics. Third, coexistence with economics. And finally, science and mystery. All right, stop number 1. Demographic realities. We're looking at the actual tangible shifts in our population and what that inevitably means for our traditional social structures. The core of the problem here is basically simple math, right? You've got a society facing a rapidly declining birth rate, hitting an aging population head-on. You just can't rely on outdated societal models anymore. If the state tries to step in and take over everything, the math literally does not work. There simply aren't enough young workers to carry that kind of tax burden without triggering massive economic stagnation. So what's the fix? Well, the author argues that if a nation relies completely on Western-style state intervention, taxes are going to rocket to the moon just to support the elderly. The proposed alternative is actually a revival of community resilience. We're talking about a return to family values and good old-fashioned neighborhood mutual aid. Instead of waiting for a nationalized bailout, creating a culture of organic, mutual support at the local level isn't just nice to have. It's an absolute necessity for survival in the 21st century. Which naturally leads us right into our second pillar: religion and politics, and the intense challenge of finding the right distance. It really forces us to ask this fantastic question. Should spiritual movements stay entirely out of government, or should they fuse with it completely? The text contrasts these two extremes beautifully. It's like walking a tightrope. On one side, you have complete isolation, totally withdrawing from the world to go meditate on a mountaintop. On the other side, total political assimilation. If a religious institution ignores society's rules entirely, it loses all its relevance. But if it becomes hopelessly tangled up in daily partisan politics, it risks losing its very soul. And the text issues a massive red flag here. If religion gets too absorbed in daily political maneuvering, it loses its purity. It degrades into what the author literally calls a mere vote-gathering machine. Total fusion with politics strips an institution of its ability to actually inspire people. You're basically reducing a grand, transcendent philosophy down to a basic political operative, which defeats the whole purpose. To avoid that trap, the text proposes a political middle path. The ideal approach? Maintain your independence so you aren't swallowed whole by a political party. Offer heavenly, forward-thinking inspiration, meaning introduce elevated ideas long before the mainstream catches on. And, crucially, entirely reject violent revolution. The goal is to peacefully guide society's progress, not to forcefully overthrow the state. Now, this delicate balancing act extends right into the financial realm for Pillar 3, coexistence with economics. Here we're exploring that historic, deeply rooted tension between ancient asceticism, the old idea of rejecting wealth for purity, and modern capitalism. Talk about a rock and a hard place. If a modern belief system completely rejects the market economy, its believers will literally starve. I mean, they simply will not survive in modern society. But on the flip side, if the institution becomes obsessed with profit-centric greed and stock market gains, it completely destroys its core philosophy. It just becomes another profit-hungry corporation. The answer provided here is building what's called an open system. Basically, you need enough tolerance and flexibility to interact with market principles, to actively participate in the economy, while simultaneously retaining a strong, independent identity. It requires a resilient structure. Because, let's face it, economic fluctuations and market crashes are going to happen, and your spiritual foundation can't collapse just because the stock prices did.
And that brings us to the fourth, and arguably the most philosophical pillar of our explainer today: science and mystery. It's the ultimate modern question, isn't it? Can a 21st century mind genuinely hold space for both astrophysics and the afterlife?
Once again, the author warns us against two major historical potholes. On one side, blind superstition. Think back to when historical institutions stubbornly refused to accept that the Earth revolves around the sun. We absolutely have to accept scientific progress. There's no going backward. But on the other extreme, we face the modern danger: pure materialism. Going so deep into hyper-rationalism that you completely strip the world of all its mystery. To highlight just how extreme this modern materialism has gotten, there's this wildly ironic quote from the text: "Souls are old-fashioned." The author points out that today, there are actual priests out there guarding graves and reciting sutras who privately believe that the concept of a soul is totally outdated. It's kind of funny, honestly, but it's also a biting critique of how deeply hyper-rationalism has infiltrated the very professions meant to protect the spiritual. To combat this, the author draws an unyielding line in the sand. Yes, we absolutely must embrace the progress of science, but the fundamental truth that humans are spiritual beings and that the soul exists, that is the definitive boundary. Surrendering that core mystery to rationalism isn't adaptation, the text argues. It's a fundamental defeat of religion itself.
Okay, synthesis, the new wind. We've covered a ton of ground across demographics, politics, economics, and science. Let's pull all these threads together to reveal the overarching blueprint for navigating the future.
When you step back and look at the whole picture, a remarkably elegant framework emerges. In politics, avoid being a vote-gathering machine. Provide independent inspiration instead. In economics, don't starve, but avoid pure greed. Build an open, resilient system. In science, reject blind superstition and pure materialism. Accept progress while firmly defending the existence of the soul. It's highly structured and yet surprisingly practical for navigating modernity. The ultimate thesis of Chapter 3 is crystal clear. To breathe this new wind into the 21st century, a belief system has to be an open system. It has to fully support the development of politics, economics, and science without totally assimilating into them. It's all about maintaining that unique perspective and that core, mysterious identity while engaging fully with the modern world.
Which brings us to the big, overarching question for today's explainer. Based on the framework we just unpacked, the challenge is pretty clearly set for all of us. Can humanity build a future where hyper-technological progress and deep spiritual mystery don't just battle each other, but actually coexist in a balanced, open system? It's a massive question to ponder as we move forward. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this text today, and keep seeking those answers.
So what will your country actually look like in 100 years? No, really, I want you to stop and think about that for a second. It's a massive, almost overwhelming question, isn't it? I mean, when we go about our daily lives, we're usually just thinking about tomorrow or next week, maybe 5 years down the line if we're feeling particularly ambitious. But projecting a full century ahead, that forces us to completely shift our perspective. It literally forces us to ask what foundation we're laying today that's going to either support or entirely crush generations of people we'll never even meet.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into a really fascinating piece of source material, focusing specifically on Chapter 4, which is titled Creating the Future. Now, the core philosophy we're exploring today is all about how a long-term vision, or honestly the lack of one, directly shapes a nation's prosperity and its very survival. As you'll see, the author argues that true national planning isn't just about economics or building infrastructure. It's really about the values, the education, and the spirit that we are instilling in our people right now.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Our roadmap for today is structured into 4 main pillars. First up, the 100-year vision. Second, the danger of lenience. Third, rethinking true education. And finally, spirit and enlightenment.
All right, starting off with Section 1, the 100-year vision, planning for tomorrow.
The source makes a really compelling case here. It says that to understand a country's trajectory, you absolutely have to look at the underlying educational philosophy being taught right at this exact moment. And the text breaks this down into a very tangible timeline spanning 3 distinct generations. Step 1 is the education of our current children. Their future is completely determined by what they're learning today. Step 2 happens when those kids grow up, become parents, and pass those compounded values on to their kids, our grandchildren. And then step 3 extends all the way down to the great-grandchildren. The author points out that what we call a 100-year vision is quite literally the continuous maintenance of an educational philosophy across these 3 generations. So what we teach today mathematically defines the entire character of the nation a whole century from now.
To really illustrate this, the source offers a fascinating historical contrast. It looks back at Japan's Meiji era, which, if you remember, was a period of just massive, rapid modernization and success. The text argues that this success wasn't because they had some perfect system or flawless institutions. No, it was driven by individual zeal. We're talking about roughly 3,000 passionate patriots who were studying day and night, risking their lives with this unbreakable will to change the country. Now, contrast that with the author's view of the modern post-war era. The source claims there's this really strong tendency today to shift responsibility away from the individual and instead place it entirely on systems and institutions. So the crucial takeaway here is this. The source asserts that over the last 50 years, relying on macro systems and just constantly tweaking legal frameworks has hit an absolute wall. Think about it. Creating a new law or slightly changing a system structure is basically meaningless if you don't have passionate, dedicated individuals actually driving it. The text is calling for a bold return to individual effort. It argues that true reform and any hope for future prosperity completely depends on a new generation of individuals stepping up with that exact same tireless, sleepless dedication that we saw in the past.
Moving on to Section 2, the danger of lenience, the trap of the welfare state.
Right here, the text shifts into a pretty sharp sociopolitical critique regarding the degradation of individual responsibility. It uses the issue of elderly care to highlight a massive societal shift. In the past, even when society as a whole was poorer, the fundamental unit of support was always the family. But now, with the rise of widespread public assistance systems, a mindset has taken root that the state will take care of us. The author argues that while this macro system might seem really convenient and well-intentioned on the surface, microscopically, it actually corrupts human nature. The argument is that it weakens family bonds and significantly diminishes an individual's drive to prepare, work hard, and actually take personal responsibility for their own future.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the specific and honestly quite provocative thesis presented. A system that is too lenient leads to national decline. The author's arguing that when a society becomes overly protective and just way too forgiving, when it completely removes the necessity for grit and struggle, it doesn't actually create some perfect utopia. Instead, the text claims it systematically breeds weakness, fundamentally undermining the entire nation's ability to survive in a highly competitive global landscape.
The source then outlines exactly how this collapse happens through what I can only describe as a chilling domino effect. It starts right in the classroom with what the author calls false equality. Basically, an environment where children are told they don't really need to study hard, where things like homework and tests are just removed so they don't get stressed out. Well, the next domino falls when capable, talented individuals fail to ever develop their true potential simply because they were never challenged. And without those capable leaders and innovators, the nation's economic wealth predictably starts to drop. This then leads to a drop in overall living standards, plunging the citizenry into poverty. And finally, a poor and uncompetitive nation is eventually forced to rely on foreign aid, losing its sovereignty and slipping into a state of national servitude. The author's point is stark. The bill for taking it easy today is paid by the subjugation of tomorrow.
Let's transition to Section 3, Rethinking True Education, Merit and Responsibility. So how exactly does the author propose we avoid this terrifying domino effect? Well, the text outlines a core economic and social philosophy, arguing super strongly against an education system driven by jealousy, one where high achievers are essentially dragged down just in the name of equal outcomes.
Instead, true education needs to foster individuals who genuinely desire to create a bigger pie for everyone. The idea is that we shouldn't be fighting over limited slices, we should be focusing on raising capable people who can actually generate more wealth, more innovation, and more overall happiness to distribute throughout the whole society.
The author completely redefines the concept of achievement here, and it's a real paradigm shift. They insist we have to teach children that studying hard and getting excellent grades is not some selfish act. Success isn't just about your own personal gain. Rather, becoming a highly capable leader means you are now equipped to take on massive social responsibilities. Achieving success is the exact mechanism by which you can return immense value and prosperity to society. It's a really inspiring call to elevate meritocracy from just a selfish pursuit into a noble public service.
And finally, Section 4, Spirit and Enlightenment, the core truth. As we slow the pace down for our final section, we transition into the deep, philosophical essence of the text. According to the source, modern education is missing its absolute core. The text observes that, largely as a reaction to the trauma and the defeat of the Second World War, the post-war era saw this intentional, systematic removal of religious and spiritual elements from the educational sphere. The author argues that pushing these philosophical depths out of our schools has created a totally sterile environment. It's left education without a foundation of absolute truth or the moral clarity needed to really ground the next generation. And this brilliantly illustrates how the author defines an educator. The text stresses that a teacher absolutely cannot just be a salaryman who's clocking in and out, merely dispensing facts from a textbook. A teacher has to be viewed as a practitioner of a sacred profession. They need to possess a moral and spiritual authority, almost like an aura, as the text beautifully describes it, that naturally guides youth, prevents delinquency, and inspires deep respect. The argument here is that the system is totally failing if it treats teachers like mere data entry clerks for the human brain. To summarize this really profound perspective, yes, practical skills are absolutely important. The text definitely acknowledges that subjects like math and languages are the necessary tools we need in the modern world. But true education, the kind of education that actually builds a society capable of surviving for hundreds of years, must ultimately reach into the depths of religious and philosophical thought. A purely materialistic, system-driven society is eventually going to run out of steam. From this perspective, practical progress has to be balanced with deep, unyielding spiritual values. Which brings us right back to where we started today. But hopefully, you're looking through a much sharper lens now. Are our current societal values, the leniency we allow, the way we define success, the macro systems we rely on, and the spiritual depth we teach, are they truly building a prosperous future for the generation living 100 years from now? It is a very heavy question, and based on this source material, finding the answer requires us to take a long, hard look at our own individual responsibilities today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you something powerful to think about. Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's explainer. We're going to completely rethink something that, let's be honest, we all chase every single day. I'm talking about success. We live in this hyper-fast-paced world that just constantly pushes us, right? Well, today, we're exploring a radical paradigm shift, moving away from materialism and diving straight into altruism. So, what does it actually mean to be successful? I mean, really, if you're feeling burned out, or if you've ever just stopped and questioned this modern, exhausting chase for achievement, believe me, you are definitely not alone. We all kind of hit that wall eventually and wonder, is this constant hustle, this endless accumulation, is that really all there is to life? Now, what's really interesting about this is that we essentially need a complete paradigm shift. Think about it. On one side, we have your typical materialistic success. It's ego-driven, it's treated like a zero-sum game, and it's entirely focused on material gain. But on the flip side, we have what the source material calls spiritual success. This is grounded in altruism, feeling a profound sense of oneness with universal laws, and, this is key, recognizing yourself as a being of light. It's literally a complete flip of the script. And, these profound insights aren't just coming out of thin air. We're anchoring today's explainer directly in this absolutely fascinating source text, The Laws of Miracles by Ryuho Okawa. Throughout our time together today, we're going to be pulling directly from the concepts laid out in this transformative book to really grasp this mindset shift. Specifically, we're zeroing in on Chapter 5, which is simply titled Success Mind. This chapter is entirely dedicated to redefining prosperity. It gives us a highly structured framework for exactly how we can navigate life's inevitable setbacks, because we all have them, without losing our deep sense of purpose. Section 1.
The modern struggle, materialistic doubts. Before we get to the solution, we kind of have to acknowledge the reality of the problem. Society's purely materialistic values often lead us right into a trap, making it incredibly easy to experience a profound loss of purpose. The text actively critiques this as the zero-sum trap. It's that deeply ingrained belief that success somehow means taking someone else's share of the pie. It creates a reality totally driven by jealousy and selfish gain. And according to the author, when your foundation is built on taking from others, you're practically guaranteeing your own despair when you inevitably hit a bump in the road.
Section 2. The Great Awakening. True World Recognition. Now, here is where the text introduces a truly inspiring call to adventure. It defines true world recognition as the profound realization that humans are not just mere material entities. Instead, we're described as children of God or Buddha, originating as beings of light from a higher heavenly realm. When you truly embrace this ultimate starting point, knowing you are inherently a being of light, wow, it completely changes how you view every single challenge in the physical world.
Section 3. Universal Laws and True Success. So, if we are beings of light, how does that actually change our daily lives? So, the crucial point is this. True success is living in oneness with the universal laws. Let that sink in for a second. True prosperity isn't about aggressively fighting the universe for your little slice of victory. No, it's about aligning your thoughts and your actions with a much larger universal flow. Remember that zero-sum trap we just talked about? The source flips that entirely on its head. Success is not taking the pie, it's supplying the pie to many. And frankly, who doesn't want more pie, right? True prosperity is really about creating abundance for everyone. When your fundamental goal is to feed others, rather than just stuffing yourself, the whole concept of jealousy is completely eliminated.
Section 4. Offering your highest self.
Now, this isn't just some high-level, abstract philosophy. The source clearly states that success is achieved by offering one's highest self for the benefit of others. It explicitly brings up the concept of noblesse oblige, which is this beautiful duty to serve and uplift others through purely altruistic thought. You aren't succeeding just for you. You're taking on the massive responsibility to bear the weight for the many. It's a real game changer.
Section 5. The Path Forward. Invoking Miracles.
Let's move on and see how this builds. As we approach the climax of this explainer, you might be wondering, how do we actually materialize these spiritual truths into reality? Well, the author lays out a super clear, actionable path. Step 1, never lose faith or hope. Step 2, continuously encourage yourself. Step 3, envision success perfectly aligned with universal laws. And finally, step 4, maintain unyielding, diligent effort. This isn't just passive wishing, it requires absolutely incredible, sustained hard work. When you combine those actionable steps, you arrive at the ultimate final promise of the source text. Diligent, altruistic effort materializes miracles and illuminates the world. The text concludes that if you continuously push forward with unyielding effort that's deeply grounded in light, your goals will inevitably materialize. And not only will you transform your own personal destiny, but you'll literally become a powerful force that illuminates the entire world around you. I want to leave you with a provocative question right now. Based on everything we've uncovered today, how will you offer your highest self to the world today? Are you going to keep fighting for a tiny slice of the pie, or will you step up and start baking a bigger one for absolutely everyone? Thank you so much for exploring this powerful paradigm shift with me. Keep learning, keep growing, and I'll see you next time.